Hi, everyone. Welcome to our final presentation of the 2023 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series. I'm Jenny Rushlow, Dean of the Maverick Lloyd School for the Environment, and we're very pleased to welcome you to our presentation today. As usual, each of our talks is worth one Vermont CLE credit, so please keep track of the talks that you attend for your records. And we'll have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation today. If you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, just enter your questions in the chat or comment space, and we'll go through as many as we can. Today, we're very pleased to welcome Lela Nargi. Lela is a Brooklyn, New York-based veteran freelance journalist covering the food system, social justice issues, science, and the environment, and the places where those topics intersect for The Guardian, the Food and Environment Reporting Network, Eater, Civil Eats, Mother Jones, Modern Farmer, and many other outlets. Lela's work has been recognized by the Aspen Institute and the Society for Environmental Journalists and has been reprinted widely. Lela joins us this term as our Summer Food and Agriculture Media Fellow, which is selected from a highly competitive pool of applicants. And today her talk is titled Reporting from the Void, Americans' Rights to Nutritious Food, Potable Water, and Clean Air. Please join me in welcoming Lela Nargi.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Jennifer, for that nice introduction. And I have to say, I don't know what a CLE credit is or if my talk be worth whatever you're getting credit for. I'm really pleased to be, this is my last day as a media fellow. It's been a whirlwind, a very fast 2 weeks, and I learned a lot, and I was really glad to be here. What I was thinking about when I was coming up with the title for this talk was how I don't really know anything about the law or legal issues, and yet my work butts up against it all of the time, which is what was so great about learning about the Farm Bill, which is what I was here to audit a class about. And so things that I might be reporting on, for example, might be IP and trademark protections for seed companies, child enforced labor in cocoa, coffee, and tea, protecting farm workers, right to repair, which is like something else completely that refers specifically to something that's been sort of unfolding over the past year or so about farmers wanting to be able to repair their own equipment that they buy specifically from places like John Deere, and they actually can't do it. They've been really working hard to have the right to do that. And then things like environmental justice issues around agricultural chemicals. I have spoken to quite a number of Vermont law and graduate school folks on staff here about things, including Fran Miller, who I know is really excited about the Farmland for Farmers Act that Cory Booker just introduced for presumably for introduction into the Farm Bill. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that she's been sort of highlighting how corporate ownership of farmland is more of a potential problem for farmers than foreign ownership of farmland, which is what Congress has been really focusing on a lot, making a big stink about China owning farmland in the US, but it's more complicated. And then things like, I just wrote 2 articles about the loosening of child labor laws that's starting to happen in a bunch of states, starting with Iowa, actually, which is now allowing children, if I'm not mistaken, as young as 16 to work in meatpacking plants. And very soon after that, that law was signed by the governor of Iowa. A 16-year-old in a chicken processing plant died, basically. So for anybody, I was speaking to the interns last week about these. They were very excited, very interested to hear about the child labor laws, and wondered why it was so a topic that was receiving so much attention and so much uproar and so much furor. And that was a pretty kind of immediate answer to what can happen when child labor laws get loosened. People actually die. So as I said, I'm not a scholar or of the law. I don't have a legal background. A lot of my reporting focuses on things like lack of enforcement. It's something that I hear over and over again, that we do actually have these laws that are meant to protect people like farm workers. For example, let me scroll down. Under US law, you're supposed to have access to clean water available to you, potable water, adequate living situations, and whether or not this is actually in our law. Part of the issue is enforcement here. There's nobody actually going to farms for the most part and making sure that these laws are being followed. So you have a lot of farm workers living in pretty desperate conditions, don't have access to clean water to drink, aren't allowed to have bathroom breaks, and then go home to increasingly hot places to live. And racism is something that comes up a lot in terms of why this is allowed to proliferate and go on. So about 70% of US farm workers were born in Mexico or Central America and may or may not be have legal status here. That's part of the issue for enforcement and why perhaps there's not as much oversight as we might like. A little while ago, I actually wrote a piece for The Counter about pesticide laws, and I actually spoke with Lori Bay-Renovand about that. And I'll just read you a little bit about what happens with pesticide laws, which we have laws on the books that are meant to protect, to make sure that you're 18 or older. You have to be certified to use chemicals. You're supposed to be provided with all sorts of equipment to protect you, but it doesn't always work out the way that the laws are meant to in terms of protections. And I'll just read a little bit from the beginning of this piece that I wrote, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago for The Counter about that. As a child growing up on his family's subsistence farm in Puebla, Mexico, Abel Luna loved helping to plant corn and other crops. But in 2001, when he turned 13, his enthusiasm quickly evaporated. That's when Luna began traveling to New York's Black Dirt region to sell his labor, quote unquote, working alongside his father in commercial vegetable crop fields. Where once he took pride in growing our own food at our own pace, he said, he now began working 14-hour or longer days from February through November. In addition to a grueling schedule and poor living conditions, Luna remembers pretty much a lack of every kind of equipment that you need. Gloves, glasses, and masks to protect him from contact with agricultural chemicals. A day spent picking tomatoes would end with his arms sticky from pesticide residue, hands burning, eyes itching. Furthermore, he said there was no one from any health agency to talk about pesticide exposure or any rights that you have. So obviously, one of many kids and other people laboring on farms in the US who are falling through the cracks. Luna's experience is hardly an anomaly. 2 studies, one from VLGS and another from the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future, exhibit just how susceptible all migratory farm workers are to dangers like pesticide exposure. Some states, like Washington and California, implemented legislation meant to better protect farm workers, but a closer look reveals that existing laws at both state and federal levels largely fail to protect those most in need of intervention. And there's an estimate of something like 524,000 children, some as young as 10, most of whom are migrants who are working on farms every year in the US. So that's one example of laws on the books that are not necessarily protecting the people they are meant to protect. And then there are other sorts of sidebars to that, not just kids who might be spraying chemicals, but children who might be, their homes might be abutting farm fields where chemicals are sprayed. A parent might take them, a very small child, to a field and put them on the side if they don't have childcare for them, which would leave children exposed to chemicals there. And then, of course, pregnant people being exposed to chemicals in the field. I've also reported on how climate change is actually worsening a lot of these impacts on farm workers. There's studies to suggest that as if the pesticides weren't bad enough, increasing temperatures are actually increasing also the potency of some of these chemicals and making the impacts even worse for farmers. And as I reported, amplifying existing hazards for already disenfranchised groups. And then exposure to heat when it comes to these kinds of things is also having having its own negative effects. It causes things like heat rash and heat stress, but can actually kill farm workers and has been quite a bit actually. And I believe it was 2 summers ago, and I don't know what the temperatures were this year. It was the hottest July on record on our planet this year. But in 2 years ago, I think it was California hit 108 degrees Fahrenheit on farm fields. And for folks like people who are picking celery, celery, when you pick it, actually has this kind of toxic juice that can inflame their skin. So they tend to wear long garments to protect their skin from exposure. They're out there working in 108-degree heat and just fully covered and not necessarily being granted water breaks, shade breaks, not having necessarily access to potable water. So there are a lot of perils with that. In addition to some of these stories where I found that the existing protections aren't really doing what they're meant to, I'd say that a lot more of what my work looks at are these supposed rights that people believe that we have. And I hear over and over and over again in my reporting, excuse me, that everyone has a right to clean, potable water to drink, and everyone has a right to enough nutritious food to eat. The truth is that actually on the books in the US, I'm sure many of you are aware, there is no right to water here in the US in our Constitution. And when it comes to food, we say that we support the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living, including food, as recognized by the Universal Declaration of Rights, of Human Rights, but we never ratify any UN treaties that look at these kinds of things. We also do not legislatively consider access to affordable, healthy food a right that necessitates any kind of government protection. We're doing all kinds of things like providing SNAP benefits and WIC benefits, but there are a lot of people falling through the cracks who believe that they have a right to nutritious food and enough nutritious food, but things don't always pan out for them that way. Interestingly, California has come close to trying to make access to water a right in California, but they seem to have just sort of fallen short of that. They've declared that every human being has the right to safe, clean, affordable, and accessible water, but 2 sentences later, their code has a tiny detail that undercuts that. It says the government doesn't have to actually provide the water. So just all these sorts of interesting ways that people really do believe that we have rights as human beings, but our laws are not necessarily bolstering that. One thing that I've been working on in the past year, and I'm hoping to continue reporting on it in the future, in the very near future, is the intersection between food security and water security, two issues that get discussed a lot when we talk about developing nations. Farmers, subsistence farmers in, countries far from here who are running out of water and therefore don't have the ability to grow food for their own food security. So a lot of folks are used to thinking about that connection, excuse me, in those ways. But here in the US, there are about 3 researchers who are looking at what that intersection really looks like here. And it's really interesting and really broad, and not a whole lot of people reporting on it. I think that we all would say that the ability to have access to water. I tricked my own self into saying the right to water. Everybody needs water to live, obviously. We need water to grow our crops. We need water for every aspect of our daily lives. But there have been so many stories looking at, and we would say, we already need this. What would be the importance of overlapping that possibly with food insecurity as well? But it's kind of interesting to me the way it's been playing out. And I'll just read you a little bit about where some of the blockages are, some of which you are very doubtless familiar with. So for this story for the Food and Environment Reporting Network, which came out a few months ago, I wrote that most estimates put US water insecurity at 2.2 million residents, but my sources believe that it's probably closer to 60 million Americans who might be spending more than 12% of their income for water and sewer service. That's one way that there's not enough access to clean, ample water. Others have lead pipes that contaminate their tap water, such as in places like Newark, or bacteria seeping into their wells, which is happening in Iowa, sewage backing up into pipes during their storms, which has been a problem in Milwaukee, nitrates running off farm fields, so many places, including Las Vegas. A storm may knock out the electricity that pumps water, which has been a big issue for Puerto Rico after a lot of these hurricanes and other storms, or knock out the pump itself, which has happened in Jackson, Mississippi. Residents of the Navajo Nation lack basic water infrastructure. And then there was some recent legislation where I'm going to just paraphrase, and it might not be exactly accurate, and forgive me for that, but the Supreme Court basically found that the government had no responsibility to provide any access to water to residents of the Navajo Nation. So and then there are other regions where the aquifers are just literally running dry, like in California's Central Valley, which is where, I don't know, something like 40% of crops come from here in the US. Water poverty has a lot to do with health beyond a primary need to drink a couple of liters a day. Perhaps most consequentially, research shows that children exposed to lead can suffer developmental delays and brain damage. People who avoid tap water are more likely to drink sugar-sweetened beverages that ups their risk for obesity, diabetes, and other diet-related diseases, with the implications most long-lasting for children. And actually, this is the piece that gets the most sort of traction in terms of folks who are trying to make the connection for legislators between food insecurity and nutrition, water insecurity and nutrition insecurity. The SSB piece has gotten the interest of, I think, Debbie Stabenow, and the water researchers that I've talked to have been pushing for things like improved SNAP benefits to cover at least partly water when people need it, when they don't have access to clean water at home, sort of as a band-aid solution, because there are other issues, obviously, that go along with not having clean water coming into your home and only getting bottled water. And the big one, of course, is that someone who is water insecure can't prepare food. And as one of my sources told me, if your tap is dry, your water has been shut off, or you're just avoiding it because you think it's dangerous, which is actually a big thing that happens, you're more likely to go out to eat, and research shows you consume a greater number of calories and have a lack of dietary diversity. So it's nutrition insecurity too. And then, of course, if you're spending money on bottled water, it might eat up as much as $100 of your monthly food budget. So if you're only getting, I don't know, for a family of four, 200 and whatever it is, $241 a month for your SNAP benefit, and you're using $100 of that for water, that's a huge issue. And then, of course, there's the issue of things like nursing mothers who are dehydrated, aren't able to have an adequate supply of breast milk. And then if they're having to buy water to mix formula, that's an expense as well. There's been some calls. I think the researchers have talked with Stabenow's office about the possibility of adding a provision for WIC in addition to the SNAP, but it's really complicated, and none of this really has taken off yet as an idea, which I'm hoping some of my future reporting, if I can get folks to pay me to do it and to pick this up, will help push forward. So in addition to that, I have looked quite significantly at some of the more up close differences between who's falling through the cracks when it comes to SNAP. SNAP is such a huge and important program for providing enough money for folks to eat who can't afford to pay for it all themselves. Um, but there are people there too who fall through the cracks. And it was interesting to me to sort of tease it apart and see who was falling through and for what reasons. And it's not all the same. It's not just a blanket sort of idea that people are on SNAP and, oh, if we can tweak this one thing, more people will have access to SNAP. Seniors, for example, are one group that is really often not getting enough from their SNAP benefits. And some examples that I had found through my own research, one was a 60-something woman who got $140 in monthly SNAP benefits. She doesn't want to buy junk food, but she struggles to afford the produce that she needs as a diabetic. Another example was a food insecure woman in her 80s who had become impoverished when her husband died, which is something that happens a lot with seniors. They lose more benefits, they lose some of their benefits and then thought they were okay and then sort of are not okay. She's too ashamed to ask her children for financial assistance and contemplates suicide. And a functionally illiterate man with an annual income of less than $12,000 relies on family members to fill out benefits paperwork and hunts game to supplement his $16 a month SNAP benefits. So obviously, really just so insufficient. This is just a tiny sampling of the challenges faced by the 25 million seniors in the US who struggle to make ends meet. And this was a report conducted in 2020 by the Social Policy Research Associates on behalf of USDA, interestingly enough. Not all seniors living below the poverty level officially qualified as food insecure, but many older Americans struggle to procure affordable, nutritious, and ample enough food. Those challenges are often invisible in a society that has outmoded ideas of grandparents surrounded by supportive family members or happily ensconced in assisted living facilities, all needs attended to. In fact, quite a number of seniors live alone. It's why the Meals on Wheels program has been so important, not just for bringing food to people who are in need of it, but also for the social isolation piece, which has been shown to really shorten people's lives. It makes them depressed. Misconceptions about seniors persist because Medicare and Social Security are seen as pretty big safety nets to protect older Americans against economic instability. But there are plenty of those who don't have a cushion, and it's striking how insecure they are and how inadequate the supplemental programs are that are meant to fill the gaps, I wrote. In addition to seniors, I've talked some about oh, and I'll just say too that those numbers are going up. Food insecurity among older Americans rose from 5.5% to 12.4% over a 10-year period, with a corresponding decrease in diet quality. College students and their challenges in terms of accessing SNAP dollars has been written about extensively, including by me. What they run up against is things like a 19-hour cap on how much they can work while they're in school, imposed by the school, and then a 20-hour need imposed on them by SNAP. As a able-bodied working adult, they're supposed to work 20 or more hours in order to be eligible for SNAP. And then there's this 1-hour gap that makes it impossible for some of them to receive SNAP benefits. And then while they may get things like a scholarship to go to school, other things come into play. The scholarship will cover their tuition, but not things like their books, or possibly their living arrangement or transportation, and they can very quickly find themselves hungry and often not able to continue going to school. They just run out of money. Foster youth was a really eye-opening experience for me to report on a few years back. And actually, I'm going to talk a little bit about carceral populations too at the end of this chat. But there does seem to be this continuum with foster youth, unhoused folks, and criminal justice involvement, and sort of this pipeline from childhood, like a lifetime pipeline of people who are underprivileged, underserved, um, just sort of losing out at every step of the way, and not just with food, but that's a big part of what I report on. As I found in a story for Civil Eats a couple of years ago, youth who spent time in foster care are more likely to experience homelessness, criminal justice involvement, low rates of timely high school and college graduation, and incomes below the poverty line. They're disproportionately drawn from families living in poverty. They typically stay in poverty as well. A report from the Center for the Study of Social Policy estimates that 30% of former foster youth receive SNAP and other food assistance, but that as many as 71% might actually need it, based on Medicaid-funded program enrollments, for example, that indicate a broader financial insecurity. There is evidence to suggest that having a literal home base can mitigate against food insecurity. An adolescent who's living in her car or sleeping on friends' couches is in a poor position to shop for food or cook for meals, and that's something that even families on SNAP are finding too. If they're living in temporary housing, even if it's a hotel room, maybe they only have a microwave, maybe they have nothing. USDA issues waivers so states can allow SNAP recipients to buy hot food rather than groceries. But this tends to be in the wake of a disaster or some other kind of emergency, and those waivers are usually temporary, so they don't help anybody really for any amount of time. College, for those who can find their way there, can provide some stability, but as one of my sources told me, 6 in 10 foster kids matriculate in community colleges, which don't actually provide housing for the most part. And even when they do, housing instability is still a complex issue. The homes of their former foster parents are no longer available to them to return to during holiday breaks, for example. And lacking family support, they don't have anywhere to go, so they end up sleeping in their cars. And this was something that I and a lot of other people were reporting on during the pandemic, just how many folks and how many college students of all stripes were really being impacted by the pandemic in ways that nobody was really prepared for. There was a lot of emergency food provisioning, trying to get up and running to help there. That was inadequate too. A lot of campuses that would have been the home base for providing emergency meals for students and others in their communities, they were closed for the pandemic. If they did remain open, or there was a food pantry open, college students didn't necessarily have the ability to get there, or they had wound up in some far-flung place. So access was really, really an issue. I've also reported a bit on the benefits cliff, which I don't think gets enough attention, and I'll only touch on it a little bit here, but basically, when you add up your SNAP and your Medicare or Medicaid and whatever benefits that you're getting, public assistance that you're getting, each one of these programs has a different sort of entry point, a different thing that you have to show in order to prove that you're eligible for it. And they can sometimes work at cross purposes with allowing people to sort of advance in their careers and to make more money. So what happens sometimes is that a person who's been getting these benefits to support themselves and their family makes a little bit of an increased amount of salary and finds themselves kicked off of not only SNAP, but their housing benefit. And so I spoke to a woman named Barbie Izquierdo, who actually works for Hunger Free America now. And it's been really interesting to me too, in my reporting, to come across so many folks who are working in these advocacy and outreach organizations who do have this lived experience, which I think is really important, and is certainly something that's changed over my decades of reporting, that you're finding a lot more people who really understand the problem from the ground floor up. And so my hope as a reporter is always that their voices will be heard. I'll do anything to amplify those voices because they do really have a very granular understanding of what's going on. So Barbie, as a single mom, contended with a cold apartment, a son who was going blind, and plenty of days when I couldn't afford to feed myself, she said. And I'll also say that she grew up in a food insecure household. So speaking earlier about that continuum, she was basically living out, following this path that had been set for her in childhood and had a hard time getting off it. She'd feed her son and daughter, who are now both teenagers, then what she calls read eat, go into another room and read takeout menus and ask, what would I want to eat today? I was feeding my brain when I couldn't put food into my stomach. Landing a full-time job was no salvation. With an hourly wage that put her $2 over the income limit for benefits, just enough to feel like you were still poor but not homeless, she said, she hit what's called the benefits cliff and was cut off from SNAP, her child care subsidy, cash assistance, and her kids' free and reduced price school lunches. So just like a complete cataclysmic halt to basically everything that had been keeping her family going for a number of years. Finally, there's some other things that I could talk about, but I've reported so much from these depressing spaces that I had to sort of home in on it, including one that's kind of an anomaly here, but also relates to people's ability to access food, and that's grocery access and restrictive covenants, which I actually found out about for the first time when I was on a panel, moderating panel at Yale Law School about food systems. And one of the panelists that I was talking to after the fact there had been researching restrictive covenants that allows supermarkets basically to prevent, even if they leave a neighborhood, prevent another food business from coming into that space. So they're sort of creating these food deserts for no good reason. They can have 100-year contract on this space and keep other food entities out for decades and decades, and neighborhoods are absolutely suffering in a lot of instances under these covenants. They can't get a grocery store in, it couldn't even be a farmer's market, and that's something that maybe you want to ask me about in questions. I can talk about that, but what I really want to talk about, and I actually have some photos of this, are carceral populations. There's so many ways that a right to food, so-called, is really missing carceral populations. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of them coming from low-income backgrounds, already are having issues with food access, and then get caught in the justice system and go to jail and or prison, and a lot of really crazy and awful things happen to them. And in a lot of these situations, food is used as a punishment against them. I think there are some laws in some states that try to prevent punitive feeding situations in prisons and jails. I'm not sure how well those are followed, how well those are actually working. There's something called a Nutriloaf, which is just this disgusting concoction that's cooked up into a loaf and served to people in prison who are often in solitary confinement and or being punished for other reasons. So my reporting on this came largely from an impact justice report, where for 18 months they surveyed people who had been incarcerated in 41 states, their family members, prison employees. They surveyed about 250 people. They got access to some, illegal cell phone photographs of what people were eating. Marshall Project actually has also done a lot of work around this issue, and they actually have some great photos, which I can share. I mean, depending on your definition of great, they're kind of disgusting. And so some of what I was reporting on here was the disordered eating and other effects of insufficient diets that people experience while serving time. Those effects can linger well after people are released. Served up in too scant portions or even withheld, Food in jails and prisons can instigate or exacerbate diet-related health issues, coping behaviors, and food insecurity that are already prevalent among communities of color that bear the brunt of mass incarceration. The abysmal quality of food in carceral settings is well documented. High in sodium and sugar, the diet in our nation's jails and prisons is severely lacking in healthy foods. More often than not, it's carb heavy and ultra processed fare. It's also frequently rotten, moldy, or vermin infested. There are all kinds of reports that Marshall Project has looked into of just like absolutely foul, like rotten, moldy insects crawling all over it. Who would want to eat that? And there's rarely enough of the food to appropriately nourish. As a result, a positive relationship with food, an essential part of being human, is denied every day to incarcerated people, according to the impact justice authors. Due to unhealthy food, people within the carceral system experience high rates of diabetes and heart disease, mental health and behavior issues, and illnesses due to foodborne pathogens. They're also subject to outright hunger. 94% of formerly incarcerated people surveyed by Impact Justice said they could not eat enough to feel full. Hunger is often mitigated only for those who can afford to purchase items in the commissary. 2/5 of those surveyed by the Impact Justice folks, where prices are often steeply inflated and out of reach to incarcerated people, making cents per hour at their in-prison jobs. Because a large number of people within the system are eventually released, it's something like 650,000 a year out of 2.5 million who are held. The lead author of this report argues that the physical and mental health of returning citizens should be a community and societal concern, which is not the reality. After release, people convicted of some offenses, like drug-related felonies, are banned from receiving SNAP and other food benefits. 91% of re-entering people report experiencing food insecurity, and many experienced hunger before that. For these populations, prison manifests as one stop along a continuum of hunger and food trauma, where the message is you are not worthy of care or good health, you are disposable. And I'll actually share a few photos here if I can. I was trying it before, it was kind of working. Let's see what I can call up here. I'm gonna do one at a time. So the first one here is from a Georgia County jail. It doesn't look too terrible, all things considered. But you can see that it's really, really carb heavy. And actually, if I'm not mistaken, this was a special meal. I see this little red dot on the top left. I think this was something like for Thanksgiving, canned fruit salad, some cereal, grits and biscuits, and then for lunch, cake, beans, rice, and mystery meat, as we would have called it when I was in school. Some cornbread, but again, this is actually a special occasion meal, if I'm recalling correctly. That was Georgia. What else have we got? We got a South Carolina lunch, and actually, the food in jails is notoriously worse than prisons, even less of an incentive and oversight in like county and state jails. So here's lunch in South Carolina: some white bread, some lettuce-like vegetable, a piece of bologna, and some macaroni salad. Oklahoma State, truly disgusting. This is like one of those illegal cell phone photos. Bread, again, some bologna. I have no idea what's in that large middle tray there. It looks like something like chipped beef. Like, I leave it to your imagination what this is. We've got Butte, Montana. Again, I guess not terrible. The eggs are likely to be powdered. The bread could be stale. It's probably margarine on there. Some canned fruit, which is okay, not terrible. At least there are some dietary guidelines being met here. Some green beans, but actually, and a little salad. But some of the folks I've spoken to in reporting this and other stories talk about the sort of kind of horror of never having like a fresh fruit or vegetable in your mouth. And one of these women was actually, she had been pulled out. She'd volunteered to work for a fire crew because she knew that she could get better food there. And I guess the pay is a little bit better. Um, and it was allowed somewhere in the regulations that they could get fresh fruits and vegetables. There was the budget for it. There was someone to source it from, but they were denied when she requested it. That was Oklahoma, Maricopa County, Arizona. Looks like more macaroni with some peas. Again, I see this like little red thing on the little red dot, which in my memory is means that it was like a special meal. So this is like a special meal. Is there another one? Yeah, here's Georgia County Jail. Oh, maybe I showed you this one already. Yep, sorry. So that's it from me. I would love to, we have like 20-ish minutes left, a little less, but I'd love to hear some questions and open the conversation up to what you guys are thinking about and what you'd like to know more about.
Great. Thank you so much, Lela. So yes, for the audience, we do have some time for questions, and you can go ahead and put those in the chat or the comment space on Facebook or YouTube. And to kick things off, we have a question from Professor Bayranovan, who thanks you, Lela, for coming, and says, you mentioned how your work often butts up to law and policy, and our work as attorneys and advocates often butts up against media and communications. How can we do better to make sure our advocacy is more accessible to the general public?
Yeah, that is a really good question and something that I've been thinking about since I've been here. And it's one of the reasons I've been so grateful to have this opportunity to come here for 2 weeks is to meet some of you guys in person, which I think is so important to opening a dialogue. And I've said it before, maybe even to you, Lori, that I think a lot of journalists aside from those who maybe come from their reporting on the law and legal issues, and that's exactly what their focus is. A lot of us don't realize that we are reporting on things that have a legal component. So the way to reach journalists is to, do what you guys are already doing to a large extent, which is sending me your reports. I think most journalists don't even realize that that lawyers are writing up reports that we can read and that have real legitimate intersections with what we're interested in and what we're reporting in and what we're seeing out there. It just opens up a whole avenue for us to explore that I think a lot of us, frankly, are not even aware is out there. I can't hear you, Jennifer, actually.
Thanks. Another question from the audience. Do you find that food deserts and insecurity are more prevalent than the average American believes?
That's such an interesting question because it's this debate now. Like the whole food desert term has really been bandied around lately by some people who are like, it's not a food desert, we need to call it food apartheid. People who push back against the idea that under-resourced people don't have access to food elsewhere. Like maybe they go to a job and they can go somewhere else. It's like a weird, interesting question. And I'm not sure it gets really into the nitty gritty in terms of whether food deserts are a larger problem. I don't know. Some people say I don't have a problem going to also the way some of these maps are drawn. Sorry, I'm like all over the place with this because it's a weirdly complicated question, even though it sounds simple. Um, when mapping is done to show where a food desert might be in a community, like it's literally not taking into account that you can cross the street out of your neighborhood and be in a place that's not considered a food desert that does have a grocery store right there. So there's like these tweaky things that kind of fall into that idea of a food desert, that people do have access like maybe even right across the street, or they have other opportunities to get groceries somewhere else that's maybe not too far off the beaten track for them. I don't know. I think it's going to depend on who you ask and what communities you're looking at. I think it's really, really, really community specific. For sure, access is an issue. I might argue that not having enough money to access what you want for food might be the bigger issue than food deserts, but that might be controversial.
Okay, another question. Do you find that regulations for specific farm worker conditions, such as water, breaks, and equipment, are lacking, or that regulations are in place but not enforced?
I think it's a little bit of both. And I would defer to, I mean, I think Lori knows about this maybe. I'm not going to say that I'm an expert even remotely, but I think both. I think that there are some federal protections. Lori, please correct me if I'm wrong, for farm workers. Um, and some states might also have some, I mean, as I mentioned, like I think California tried to have better protections, and some other states have been looking at that too. But yeah, I mean, I think over and over again, what I hear in my reporting is that, especially with migrant communities and people who are not white, like there's just not a huge impetus to go and look for violations. Um, and then when violations are found, like what's that mechanism for enforcing any kind of mitigation? That's the other part of it. And again, like it's a case by case basis. Like I've been on farms where, very large farms where the guy who owns the place is like legitimate. You can see where his workers live. You can see that they're smiling. You can see that there's water set up for them and porta potties. Like you can actually see what a good farm looks like. And there are farmers who are complying with the law, but then, some of the photographic evidence, um, and actually a lot of people who are sometimes finding these discrepancies in terms of how people are living are some of the field medical people who are going out like and doing like farm worker health stuff like on site. And then the unions, obviously. Some of those photos coming out of those situations can be really, really stark, and who's enforcing it? Nobody.
So Professor Baranovan chimed in the chat and said, yes, there are some regulations protecting farm workers at the state and federal level, but there are concerns they're not protective enough and that they aren't enforced. And when they are enforced, that the fines are too low to make a meaningful difference. And for anybody who's watching who's not embedded at the school, Professor Laurie Bayronovan is the director of our Center for Agriculture and Food Systems, which produced a report on farm worker legal issues that's available on the website for the Center for Ag and Food Systems. I have a question in light of the fact that you took the Farm Bill class these last 2 weeks. So the Farm Bill is very fundamentally flawed, but one of the ways in which it's pretty challenging is the horse trading that happens between nutrition benefits and agriculture and agricultural subsidies, and that is the result of a lot of politics, really mostly sort of trying to get everybody to have some skin in the game. So was there anything that you learned in this class about the Farm Bill and how it contributes to the conditions of hunger in this country that you've reported on?
I mean, we were talking actually about this in class yesterday, and I think one of the things that I'm gonna have to like go away and think about what was discussed over these 2 weeks, because it was a lot, and two different professors with their own, I mean, obviously overlapping interests and understanding of the way this works, but their own particular takes on it. So there's a lot to go and process. But one thing that I brought up yesterday in class that's been sort of highlighted by like hearing these guys talk about it is that in a lot of ways it seems like we're we know that SNAP benefits, for example, are extremely impactful and important for now a growing number of people. Like we actually managed to mitigate a bit with all of the pandemic money that we were tossing out. That actually helped. Um, but it's been said to me over and over again in my reporting about this that, you know, the root cause of the problem isn't food insecurity, the problem is poverty. And so it just, talking about these things in the Farm Bill class and hearing about, yeah, the horse trading, as you say, just sort of reaffirm this idea that, yeah, it's this massive, massive band-aid solution that was designed to address a problem a long time ago that has evolved, and our understanding of the challenges and the problems has evolved too. And yet I forget what it was before the pandemic hit. I think rates of food insecurity had remained relatively stable at around 12% nationally for 10 years. Like every once in a while you see a little bit of a wobble, but like really no real progress made on getting rid of food insecurity. That's presumably what we're trying to accomplish here. So I do come away with the feeling that it would be really great if that could be reassessed and reanalyzed in terms of what we're actually trying to accomplish, and if there might not be other things we could be discussing and addressing beyond just SNAP benefits, right? Which, as I say, like absolutely essential to people, but not getting them anywhere near where they want to be in terms of being off SNAP either. Can't hear you again. I think you're muted.
Thank you. Do you have any experience from your reporting on the ways in which maybe urban communities in particular facing hunger and nutrition challenges have opportunities to grow their own food and kind of work outside of the system in that way? And I mean, I know urban agriculture has had a moment, but I think at least from where it stood last that I was working on it, not clear that it has been able to proliferate in the ways that we hoped.
Yeah, that's true. And I guess there is some talk about it in the Farm Bill too, but we didn't get too much into that these 2 weeks. There was just way too much. From my own experience living in New York and seeing what's happened with urban ag there, like there's some kind of fascinating things. The problem, of course, is that there's money for these projects and then the money goes away. And so you make these
Hmm.
strides and it looks really hopeful and impactful and everybody is psyched. And it's like, finally, we've like cracked it. We've found this thing that's going to be really terrific. And then the funding disappears. And one of those things, and I'm actually not sure if the funding has disappeared. I really want to revisit this story, but success depends on a consortium, right? And so one of the great stories in New York City a couple of years ago, right before the pandemic, was so NYCHA is the New York, it's our housing authority. I forget how many buildings we have in NYCHA for, affordable housing for New Yorkers. They're the big projects. And Gesundheit, bless you. I didn't hear it, but I saw it. One of the many residents living in NYCHA housing have food insecurity and are receiving many types of public benefits. If I'm not mistaken, NYCHA is probably Section 8. So somebody had this sort of great, I don't know what genius came up with this idea. NYCHA has some of these projects have a lot of available land. And so there was this group that came together to take clean soil. So New York has a clean soil project. So you excavate to build new buildings, and then you have all of this soil. What are you going to do with it? Usually you truck it off somewhere at great expense. And so the Clean Soil Initiative was meant to take some of that soil, if it didn't have lead contamination, to do whatever was needed to remediate it in other ways, and then bring it to use it as soil for community gardens. And so they connected that with a program called Farms at NYCHA, where they were using clean soil. They were starting community gardens on NYCHA property, using workers, farmers in training who were hired by AmeriCorps. So getting training in farming and getting paid, and all these kids, they were adolescents. I think they were under the age of 25. Were getting paid by AmeriCorps. They were getting training, and they all came from these communities. They were all kids who had grown up in NYCHA housing projects. So they were going back to their communities. And so they started farms on 6 NYCHA properties was the last count I had when I followed this story, with this clean soil. And then residents could come down, and there would be, anybody could help who wanted to. And then twice a week, there would be a farmer's market a free farmer's market at each one of these NYCHA farms. And residents were also encouraged to bring their food scraps to be made into compost. So they had created their own closed loop system, because New York City also has this initiative to compost. So they were actually creating this whole kind of amazing thing right there on these properties that was really inspiring, and everybody had good things to say about it. There seemed to be no way to fail with it, and I have no idea if it survived.
It does sound like it sort of learned from other urban agriculture projects in other cities. You know, when you started describing, well, there's land that's available, my immediately thought, where are folks going to get clean soil to, you know, because these have to be raised beds, you know, you have to assume that the ground is contaminated. So just the fact that a solution was developed there is enormous. I know it's hard enough to get groceries to your place in New York, let alone truck in soil from who knows where. So that's maybe a positive note to end on, that some solutions are being or have been tried, and we'll hope that the funding has continued for that. Thank you, Lela. We should wrap up, and thank you to everyone who joined us throughout the summer for these talks. I know it's been stimulating and enjoyable on our end. And all of these presentations will be viewable online, so you can revisit them in the future if there's some tidbit that you want to hear again. So you'll be able to find those on the Vermont Law and Graduate School YouTube channel. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Lela, and have a great rest of your summer.
Thank you.